And we're live back in the lighthouse. It's good to see you again. I'm looking around. The view is pretty good. Looking outside, I see some more stars up there. Hey, thanks everybody for putting those up there in the sky. Now, we are now moving to the next constellation, democracy and governance. And for this speaker, I'm pretty excited. I think you all are, especially if you've been taking Perry Merling's money and banking class, because, as you know, Perry teaches you how to read the Financial Times. Martin Wolf, we were very excited for your next talk. We were looking forward to your suggested questions. For all of you who are viewing us and looking at the live stream, we invite you right back into the platform. Click on the Democracy and Governance constellation. Up in the sky, we're going to be talking some really important, input questions from our speaker, and we were looking forward to your suggestions as well. So go into the constellation, and I also want a quick shout out to Maria. I'm really looking forward to your moderation. I know you're very excited. You're part of the original TA class of Perry's, and I know this is a very special session for you as well. So Maria, I hope you're going to enjoy this together with all of us. Again, go to ysiplenary.org, go to the Democracy and Governance constellation, and we'll see you all there. Suggest your questions, and Martin Wolf will reflect upon them. See you.
Let's talk economy, democracy, and governance. Economy, democracy, and governance. How they come together and how best do they fit? As I say this, I don't know who my next president is. What's the role of government in trying to balance theoretical equality with broad disadvantage? How much cash you need to be at peace and to manage within the hazardous path of this existence's passage? Money isn't something that's inherently there. Neither is democracy. You may not be aware that your democratic liberties are fragile as a share in the market. You can lose it. Do economists care? There's a lot there, I'm just asking, no judgments. It's a public apparatus, but who pushes the buttons? What's the democratic cost when the economy's bumping, but we're losing all our trust in the concept of governance? Let's talk economy, democracy, and governance. Economy, democracy, and governance. It ain't even over yet, but 2020 was intense. Economy, democracy, and governance.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Cecilia Ricab, and I am the question moderator of this session. As you probably know, the main aim of the YSI virtual plenary is to collectively arrive to the 100 most inspiring and pertinent questions of our time. And these questions will guide our future research and projects. Today, we are in the Democracy and Governance constellation, and we will host an input talk of Martin Wolf, editor-in-chief of the Financial Times. In the graph, you will already be able to see 3 questions that were suggested by Martin Wolf in advance and that will be guiding his presentation. On top of that, during his talk, you will all have the chance to suggest questions that you want, on the one hand, to be asked to Martin Wolf, but at the same time that you think are relevant questions that we should address collectively as a community. Also, during the talk, all of us will be able to like the new questions that are suggested. And the questions that receive most likes will afterwards be asked to Martin Wolf to comment upon them. After Martin Wolf's talk, we will also have a time to rephrase, to rework collectively on the questions that were discussed with Martin Wolf. And before the session ends, you will also have an opportunity to select your favorites, if any of the questions that will be discussed today are among your top 10 favorites. Remember that at any point in the plenary, you can choose your favorites, and if you arrive to 10 and then you want to favorite more, you can just unfavorite some of the first ones and select those that you prefer the most next. With this favoriting, we will arrive to the 100 most pertinent questions of our time. So, with no further introduction, I will just give the floor to Maria to introduce our speaker.
I would like to very warmly welcome our speaker, Martin Wolf. We're very, very excited to have you with us, and we're very honored that you are able to join us today. Martin is an associate editor of the Financial Times, and he's also their chief economics commentator. And it's definitely not an understatement to describe him as one of the most influential financial journalists of our time. The most important reason why we've invited him today is that he's currently working on a book on the crisis of democratic capitalism. And that's what he will be talking about for the next 20 to 25 minutes. Before I turn it over to Martin, I would like to provide you with a little bit more background and contextualize Martin's personal journey a little bit. I'm going to cite 4 highlights from his Wikipedia bio, because I always find it important to contextualize where people and where speakers come from and what personal experience and set of values they may bring to the table. First highlight I'm going to flag is Martin is born to Jewish parents who both fled the continent and the Holocaust. And he recalls and feels that his background left him wary of political extremes and encouraged his interest in economics, as he felt that economic policy failures were one of the root causes of World War II. Second highlight, he joined the World Bank in the 70s. And by the start of the 80s, he was very deeply disillusioned with the bank's policies undertaken under the direction of Robert McNamara. Third highlight and citation, up until the late 2000s, Martin was an influential advocate of globalization and the free market. Fourth and last highlight, after the 2007 and 8 financial crisis, he became one of the more influential drivers of the Keynesian resurgence. And he used his platform to advocate a massive fiscal and monetary response to the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. So with these highlights at the back of your mind, I'll leave it now to Martin to speak about the crisis of democratic capitalism. Thank you again, Martin, for joining us today.
So it's first of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you. And before I talk about this, there's just one thing I'd like to add into this very kind and very useful introduction, which is that my intellectual background is also a little peculiar, and it explains another important aspects of my interest in this topic. So, as is normal in British schools, I specialized rather young, and it's a long time ago, of course, in the 60s. And for about 5 years of my life, I did basic nothing but Latin, Greek, and ancient history. And that became a very, very deep part of my intellectual background. And then when I stopped doing that in Oxford, I switched to politics, philosophy, and economics. So I did a lot of politics and philosophy. So my background as an economist is very peculiar, and this no doubt explains why I ended up as a journalist, not an academic, which is very important to understand. And though I did a graduate degree in economics at Oxford, I didn't bother to do a PhD because I knew I wasn't going to be an academic, which makes me rather an inappropriate guide to what you should be doing in research. But nonetheless, I've been invited, so I'm going to talk on this topic. And my book is indeed on the crisis of democratic capitalism. But what I'm going to focus on here is what I think the questions are that one should be asking oneself. And I think they're very, very, very significant, that they go well beyond conventional economics. Indeed, I don't think one can think about this topic within the lens of conventional economics. And that, I think, is an enormous intellectual challenge. Indeed, my own view is that we need somebody who will create or recreate ways of thinking about the world which are similar to those of the great 19th century thinkers on the political and economic system, but different, because I think a lot of the way they thought, Marx is obviously the most significant one, the way they think are no longer fully relevant. So that's my introduction, and I'm going to start with a couple of quotations which will help anchor the way I think about democracy in its current state. And I think it's pretty obvious. We're in the middle of this remarkable U.S. presidential and national election, and it's pretty clear, I think, to anyone who isn't blind, that democracy is in a rather strange state when the president of the most important democratic country is arguing that an election, which is the most important act of a democracy, is fundamentally fraudulent. So I have a president running against the election and electoral system of his own country, when that country is the most important democracy, indicates, to put it mildly, that we are in a crisis state of a kind we haven't been in democracies since the 30s. And that's why this is such a huge issue. So anyway, my first quote is from one of my favorite thinkers, Aristotle, his Politics. And he said, "It is clear then that the best partnership in a state," what he meant by this is a constitutional state with democratic elements, "is the one in which operates through the middle people, what we would call the middle class. And also that those states in which the middle class is large and stronger, if possible, than the other two, which were the plutocracy, the oligarchy, and the very poor, or at any rate stronger than either of them alone, have every chance of having a well-run constitution," which basically meant to him, as I said, an orderly system of democratic rule. And the second quote is completely different, but also relevant, as you will see. It's from Ernest Hemingway, and it's a very well-known quote, in which somebody asks another character in the novel, "How did you go bankrupt?" And his reply was, "How did I go bankrupt? Two ways: gradually, then suddenly." And I think in the same way, we have suddenly discovered that our political system in significant parts of the West, and indeed of the world, is bankrupt. So I'm going to cover 4 topics. First, the fragility of democratic capitalism, this combination of a market-based capitalist economic system with a political system which is at one is both national, it's defined by a geographical location, and in principle egalitarian. The second topic I'm going to discuss is the recession of democratic capitalism, or I would just say the democratic recession, as the great scholar Larry Diamond, who teaches at Stanford, one of the world's leading scholars of democracy, refers to as the democratic recession. We've been in for now 15 years, and some would say in some parts of the world it looks like a democratic depression. And then I'm going to focus on some hypotheses to explain this in the zones of economics, culture, and politics. And I'll indicate all of them are relevant. And working out how they interact is, I think, a core problem for scholars in dealing with. And that then leads me to a 4th section, which is just very simple, which is that I think we need to recreate. And if I knew how to do it, I would not be doing what I'm doing. We need to recreate an integrated way of thinking about political economy, what used to be called political economy 2 centuries ago, before economics hived itself off as a very separate discipline with very separate methodologies. So let me then go through these 4 sections. First, the fragility of democratic capitalism. The rise of democracy. This is all based on the book, which is virtually finished now. 200 years ago, according to the Polity 4 database, there were no democracies in the world. There was no country where a large proportion of the population voted. And even in the United States at that time, only 6% of the population, had the vote. They were obviously all men, it excluded all women, and it excluded obviously slaves. And even among men, there was a property qualification. So it was based in an oligarchy. And that was the most democratic society pretty well going at that time. But as capitalism rose, in the 19th century. Strangely, or perhaps not strangely, so did democracy. And they emerged together. And that's quite interesting. Indeed, I think it's incredibly important. Why did this happen? Well, I suggest there are sort of two big factors. First, at the level of ideas. I'm one of those people who thinks ideas really matter. I'm with Keynes on this. It's not just about interests, very far from it. It's about ideas. And there are three ideas which were very important. The first was the move from ascribe to achieve status. In other words, the move away from a society in which people's status was essentially determined by what they were at birth. Did they start off as a serf, a free person, or were they actually nobility? That was pretty fundamental. Of course, it didn't get rid of all ascribed status, most obviously between men and women. And of course, serfdom survived and slavery was introduced into basically all the European colonies, or many of them. But nonetheless, this move from ascribe to achieve status was very profound, and it really occurred in the 18th century. The second was that there's a basic idea in capitalism, in market economies, that people are entitled to engage freely in what I think Adam Smith called truck, barter, and exchange. And that meant, of course, that you thought that individual choices have inherent value. People should be allowed to make choices in markets. Well, that follows sort of logically then, my third point, that if you think that, then the idea of democratic citizenship, that of individuals cooperating in the public sphere to make decisions based on their individual choices, just makes sense. Why allow people to have free choice in one area and not in the other? And I think that became increasingly compelling. So this is the level of ideas. And then, of course, enormously powerful economic forces were unleashed by capitalism. It meant by its nature free labor. That was part of what the Civil War was about in the US. It led to the collapse of serfdom and ultimately, after a lot of conflict, slavery. It led to much greater prosperity, though that took a long time and it involved a lot of conflict. It meant, and that was very important, the need for mass education. The capitalist class wanted an educated labor force. It meant the rise of organized labor as a political force, very important. And it meant, because people were getting better off, the opportunity for a positive sum politics. So I think all these factors were very important, explaining the coincidence, which is very remarkable, between the development of the market-based capitalist economy in the 19th, and I'm talking about the areas where it really took off, mainly the industrial West at that time. But the conflict, symbiosis between the two, if that's the word. It's not entirely, because it's also one of conflict, and I'm going to come to that now. So there are very significant frictions between democracy and capitalism, and always have been, as well as this symbiosis. So I think of it as a bad marriage, or a very difficult marriage. They need each other, but they don't work together very well. So obviously, capitalism by its nature tends towards being global. There are economic opportunities across the globe, and so you want to exploit them. And democracy is inherently local. It's bound up with a particular location, of particular political institutions. And of course, the people who have the voice in democracy are the people who are citizens of that jurisdiction, which is physically defined, has always been physically defined. Democracy is, of course, the domain, in Hirschman's famous phrase, of voice, while capitalism is inherently the domain of exit. So two very different ways of organizing decision-making. Democracy rests on an essentially egalitarian ideal, at least once we got to universal suffrage about 100 years ago, that of one person, one vote, while capitalism rests on an inegalitarian ideal, namely your vote in the market depends on the resources you possess. $1, one vote. If democracy or the market economy fail, and I'm going to come to this in a moment, there is a strong historical tendency for demagogy, plutocracy, or autocracy to emerge. And so capitalism and democracy may be a sort of marriage of some kind, but it's surely a difficult one. And that's the great theme of my book. And it's brought me back to concerns I had as a young person, but which sort of seemed to disappear as the West triumphed in the Cold War. And most of us thought, well, this problem of the autocratic stroke totalitarian reaction against democracy was no longer a serious problem. Now, the second section, I said I would talk about the recession of democratic capitalism. Now, what Larry Diamond has talked about, as I said, the democratic recession, most of the data on, which are, of course, problematic on how many countries are democratic, how strong their democratic institutions are, how deeply entrenched the basic principles of liberal democracy, that is free elections, free media, the rule of law, and so forth, how entrenched they are, indicate that sometime in the middle of the first decade of this century, things started to get worse. And the world seems to be seeing a move away from democracy with the rise of autocratic populism, illiberal democracy, as somebody has called it, the Hungarian prime minister, and of course, outright autocracy. And this is true across the world, but you can clearly see elements of it in what used to be thought of as consolidated democracies in the West, notably in both the US and UK, which were very important democracies in the middle of the 20th century. And of course, in addition to this erosion of democracy in regions where they seem relatively well developed, and also in very important parts of the emerging world, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in South Asia, in East Asia, we are, of course, seeing something else, which is we have a new superpower in the world, China, which has adopted what I refer to as communist autocratic capitalism, if you like, a very strange hybrid, which seems to fit the historical Chinese mode of organization. And there are many other countries that have succumbed, as I suggested already, to demagogic versions of autocratic capitalism. And nationalist populism, at least, has been incredibly successful politically in some core democracies. So something is going on here, which is very big. I've got lots of charts in my book on the democratic recession, which I won't go into. But clearly, if you thought 30 years ago, as Fukuyama did, that democracy had won and the Western system had won, this is not something anyone would really think now. So obviously the question is why? And that's my third section. And I'm going to focus here, because my book does, and because it's very personal, on the Western democracies. There I have a lot of views about what's going on in the emerging world, and I do think they're related, but it's not what I'm going to concentrate on. And I'm particularly interested in what's been happening in the US and UK for fairly obvious reasons. I think there are 5 sorts of explanations out there for the democratic recession. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive, by the way. The first set of explanations, which are very central to my thinking, as you'd expect, because I'm an economist, is economic failure. That is to say, the middle class has been collapsing, and that's what Aristotle would warn us would happen. And the other way you can say is our political and economic system has been going bankrupt for decades, and after the financial crisis, it was sudden. The second set of hypotheses, which I think are very significant, is the nature of elite conflict and how elite conflicts emerge in our contemporary societies. The third, which is related to the second but not the same, is the way elites have been discredited. And this fits in very well with quite established theories of democracy by people like Schumpeter. The role of elites is central to make democratic systems work. And if they're discredited, the system starts to corrode very, very quickly. And there's an opening for demagogues who are power seekers. And that gets to the fifth explanation, that there are times when the people who are, as it were, a universal type in human history, people with a lust for power, that's a universal characteristic, have an opening to seize power. And we've seen this throughout history. It happened in the ancient world. It happened, of course, in Europe in the 20s and 30s, and it's happening again. So, and these are not mutually exclusive. And the important point is they're all different aspects of the fundamental point. This is a social phenomenon, and social phenomena involve everything. So let me just go through them very quickly, and then I'll conclude with, because to me, that's interesting. So the economic failures or the economic developments are deindustrialized. I just stress 5 of them. There's so many more, but deindustrialization, basically the disappearance of the industrial working class, which was a massive force in the politics of the Western world in the middle of the 20th century, political force, social force, and it has been atomized by basically the deindustrialization process, which is in large part, but not entirely, technologically driven. And it's certainly more driven by that than by trade, in my view. The second thing, linked to that, but essentially separate, is rising inequality, which is clearly linked to a number of forces, but in my view, most significantly, changes in the nature and operation of the firm and changes in the role of financial markets. The third factor is slowing productivity growth, very clear since the 70s, and a further deceleration since the financial crisis. So underlying growth is very low. And if you've got rising inequality and underlying growth is very low, it's pretty obvious. Vast proportion of the population experience no increases in their living standards. And that's exactly what's been happening. Then that has come together in this idea of rigged capitalism, which I've done quite a lot of writing about. And on top of all this, and this is linked with rigged capitalism, there was the massive shock of the financial crisis. And I think the really important point about a financial crisis and why it's so important is it's a failure which is so dramatic, so obvious, and so obviously the fault of the people who are in charge, who are supposed to understand all this, the people in the financial sector and the government, that it destabilizes any sense that the people in charge are either decent or competent. And that, to me, is the economic story. The second story, which I like very much, and it fits very well with what's happening in America, interestingly, comes from Thomas Piketty, which surprised me, but I think it's his basic idea, which is very much in his last book, very different from his book, the book that made his reputation on capital. So he basically suggests that the vast majority of the people, largely because of the collapse of institutional forms like trades unions and so forth, are outside active political life, which is a very important and very unfortunate development. And there are 2 groups that are really active in politics. The commercial elite and what he calls the Brahminic elite, which you might call the intelligentsia. And the commercial elite, the richest, the plutocracy, want free markets, low taxes, and state support when needed. But basically, they want free markets and low taxes. This is the bourgeoisie in Marxist sense. And the intellectual elite basically runs government. They run universities. They want straight direction. And on the whole, they want more public spending. And his view, or one way of interpreting his view, is that the commercial elite, both of these are minorities. So in elections, they have to attract the support of others. If they're going to win elections, their interests will never be sufficient. And so basically the commercial elite motivates the support of a large part of the population by appealing to national identity and the virtues of traditional culture. That's the right-wing coalition, if you like. And the leftist coalition also motivates support by appealing to minority identities and the value of new culture, new, more egalitarian culture. And that's the core divide in our societies today, very different from that of the middle of the 20th century. And as I said, a crucial element in this way of thinking about our politics is the loss of political agency of working and middle class people, as the institutions which were collective institutions and therefore able to bring their voices together actively in politics disintegrated. And the media echo chamber reinforced this sort of division of politics, which I think is pretty poisonous. And I think this is a very brilliant way of thinking about where we are. The third element is the discrediting of elites, and which is the active hostility of important parts of our population to the collective elites that they see. The corporate elites are discredited by being seen as greedy and with their willingness to up sticks and move unpatriotic. The political elites are also discredited by being seen as being greedy and incompetent and servile to the corporate elites. But government elites are also discredited by failed policy making on finance and health and what is seen now as perverse and damaging policy making on trade in some important countries. And then finally, cultural elites are discredited in the eyes of large proportions of the population because they are seen as completely indifferent to, if not hostile to, the values of much of the population. So we live in an environment where elites are discredited, and that leaves you with the possibility of having the charismatic individual, which I'll come to in a moment. So the fourth aspect of this, again, I stress these are all linked, is cultural division. Changing cultural norms on gender identity, sexuality, education, immigration, and national identity. These are genuine and for most of us, I'm sure, valued changes. But this sense that the cultural norms on which society is based are dissolving to their disadvantage. Is clearly bites harder when people feel economically secure as they do now. I tend to think of cultural change, moreover, and I don't have the time to go into this in detail, as being very close to economic change. It's not a separate thing. There's a huge debate in the literature on whether you can ascribe what's happening to cultural change or economic change. It seems to me temporarily, it's clear that economic change had a huge force. It's not an accident. There's this huge explosion of populist nationalism after the financial crisis. But I also think that many of the cultural changes we are seeing have very powerful economic roots. But they are, I'm no doubt, factors. And then finally, there's the permanent point, which I made already, lust for power and the role of the demagogue. Autocracy, we should remember, is the normal human system of governance through ever since states were first formed. Lust for power is an age-old human behavior. Appeal of the charismatic leader seems to be eternal. And the demagogue is, of course, the democracy's version of such a leader, as Plato told us in the first great work of political philosophy and theory, The Republic. So, and of course, the rise of the demagogic dictator is reinforced by important elements in society, including parts of the intelligentsia. And in addition, the support of enthusiastic oligarchs. So I've given you 5 dimensions or aspects of what people think explains what's going on. So finally, I think I've more or less kept in time. I think this creates this erosion of democracy, the democratic recession, and the links with our economic system are among the most important challenges of our time. For many ways, partly because I like democracy and believe in it, partly because I think where we are now makes it impossible to act effectively at all because politics is so poisoned on really big issues like climate. So this is a huge issue. And while economics is deeply involved, economics is not cannot be separated from other aspects of human social organization in explaining or analyzing this phenomenon. And this is most obviously of something like this. I mean, economic life is always part of a wider social life, and separating economic activities from other aspects of human social activities is pretty near impossible. But when we're talking about political developments of this kind of political decision-making, it really is impossible. So somehow we need to recreate a form of social science that incorporates the different aspects of human social and political arrangements into one coherent whole. And everything that has happened in the social sciences has gone in the opposite direction. So this is a tremendously challenging thing to do, but I think something that young scholars have to try to do. I think it's very hard, but it will be essential. So I consider what the issue we're talking about not only of immense importance in our lives, but also in immense importance for our future intellectually. How we tackle questions like this in a rigorous and persuasive way that's a question which I think will demand a great deal of original and powerful thinking. That's what I have to say. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Martin. A lot of food for thought, and I like how the stars align here because you used that Hemingway quote, "How did you go bankrupt?" First, suddenly, gradually, then suddenly. I used this quote in my PhD thesis on the second page because I wrote about the global financial, the systemically important banks. So I thought that was kind of a nice quote to use for that. I want to start off with a clarificatory question before we launch into the questions constellation. And I like how you say that it's sort of one of the main endeavors that we need to strive for is to recreate a social science that helps us to and allows us to think about political economy in an integrated way. And I think you said that capitalism and democracy in some way are in a bad marriage, and that and there's a natural friction between the two. And there used to be a time where this friction was perceived as one of the biggest problems in capitalism and in democracy. When do you think this the perception of this friction as a problem was no longer like sort of center stage and was no longer perceived as a problem and a subject to discussion and a subject that needs to be tackled by each generation? And how did this materialize itself and manifest itself, and why do you think this happened? I kind of want to dive back a little bit to the historic root causes and get your thinking on that.
Well, my sense is that, and I really wouldn't claim deep expertise on all the literatures. In the beginning of the thinking about the market and society and political organization, the people who were thinking about it tended to think in silos. So there was remarkably little discussion of in the 19th century of politics, of capitalism and democracy, because pretty well all the economists who are writing about this subject were anti-democratic. Mm-hmm. They didn't want democracy. They tended to be people who thought that if you gave everybody the vote, God knows what would happen. They'll steal everybody's property. And there's still a very significant element of that in the libertarian right. I mean, they rarely get up and say nowadays, well, actually, let's get rid of democracy. But there are plenty of people who do write it. One of the authors I address in my book, a philosopher at Georgetown, I think, whose name temporarily escapes me, basically says, well, I want the free market, so we've got to kill democracy. And that was, people in the 19th century who are in favor of the market would say that's natural. And to some significant extent, They've always tended to think that. And then on the Marxist side, the tendency was to think that, well, we'll get rid of capitalism. So it's going to end, and then we'll have some sort of perfect political system in which society organizes itself in a way which is somehow democratic and free without any private property. And that was their view of this thing. So it seems to me that until somehow democracy emerged, and it emerged as a response to all the pressures that I mentioned in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and I didn't even talk about the mobilization for war, suddenly they got democracy because there was no alternative. And at that stage, they sort of say, well, let's make the best of we can. And sometimes it failed and sometimes it went wrong. And the communism went off into a separate world as a result of the Leninist revolution until it collapsed, and democracy wasn't really part of the ways of thinking about it. So what seems to me striking is how little serious thought when I went to look at it, and I'm not saying I've added to it, I've tried, there really was to how to fit these two things, because they came together in a way almost, well, they didn't come together by accident, that would be completely wrong, but they came together unintentionally. It's where we ended up. And then after the first burst of universal suffrage, democracy and markets, there was this tremendous interwar collapse, and it restarted. Now, the one exception to this, the one really important exception to this, is the United States. But of course, the United States is a very strange democracy, and I won't be able to go into all the history of that either. But they did sort of take it for granted most of the time that you had to have representative political institutions at least. And there was a sort of, Lincoln's famous government for the people, by the people, I can't remember, of the people, though it wasn't, of course, universal suffrage democracy. But anyway, that was an essential part of the American thing. And in the middle of the 20th century, the American victory in the war ended us up with this marriage, which I like, but it turned out to be very difficult. And we didn't really think very much or rigorously about how these two phenomena work together, because it was sort of taken for granted, as Fukuyama did. They just work because they're so much better than communism. And now, I think it's now that we're being forced to think really seriously, how do you have a global economy with national democracy? What is the legitimate relationship between them? What happens if the losers in your national democracy are being pulverized, while actually the world is doing quite well with this? Lots of people are benefiting. These are all the questions which I think, I'm sorry, this is a very long answer, I apologize, but I think these are questions that we now have to think about. And though, of course, there are some very distinguished philosophers, Schumpeter's great book, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, but a lot of that thinking came out really in the middle of the 20th century, when it was obvious the thing wasn't really working. And then it started working again, so people stopped thinking about it.
Okay, so implicitly you're debunking the myth of the good old times where things were easier and where things had already been resolved. I
think that is correct. In the middle of the 20th century, Karl Polanyi's, Hayek, Schumpeter, this was for very obvious reasons when they were really thinking about these questions. They came to very different conclusions because they were really, and why were they doing it in the middle of the 20th century? Because it was a disaster. And the reason why we're being driven back to think about it now, because it's a disaster.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And on the US, just adding as a footnote, I think they had figured out that they wanted democratic governance, but I'm not sure they had figured out what kind of economy they wanted. As I recall, there was this conflict between Jefferson and Hamilton, who went back and forth on how the economy should be organized and what they should be striving for.
Indeed, and Hamilton won, of course. But actually, they didn't want democracy. They wanted republican institutions, and they wanted to entrench the power of the oligarchy as much as they possibly could. So the American Constitution, that's another story, is a very interesting stage in this, which has created deeply unresolved problems, which are perfectly obvious this week.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so we're launching into the questions constellation. And you had already touched upon China. And the first question is, what could and what should change in the US-China relationship after the US election? So this question, we're not trying to strive and find the answer here and come up with prescriptive policy ideas, but we want to reflect on the relevance of the question and how we can think about this question against the background of your talk. So when we think about what should change in the US-China relationship after the US election, what's your sort of first take at the question, or how do you want to link it to your talk about maybe the fragility and I think you mentioned a conflict of elites also, right? Maybe that's how this can be linked.
Well, one way into, rather than trying to resolve this, we might want to ask why this question matters.
Yes.
I think there are three reasons why it matters, and it's pretty obvious why it's very difficult to resolve. It matters because one of the things we've done in the last couple of centuries is to create a global impact upon the biosphere of human activity. And so if you think part of political systems, any political system, is designed to manage collective action problems, that's why you have a political system, right? If we could do this without it, one wouldn't need it, but we do. There are lots of collective action problems, but the biggest collective action problems now are global ones. They're the most important. And so they can't be resolved without global cooperation. And these are the two biggest players, so it can't be resolved without their cooperation. And so US-China relationships matter because it's the only way, it's a necessary condition for managing global collection action problems. And that relates among, perhaps it is these global collection action problems to me are essentially in two areas: the global commons and the interaction among, well, three areas: the global commons, the interaction among states, which is peace, just peace. World wars are very bad for everybody, and that's pretty obvious, and lots of work on that. And third, of course, prosperity, because we are so integrated. So, and it links with it links with my basic theme, which goes back actually to my globalization book, which is we have to deliver these collective action, we have to manage these collective action problems well, while all the political legitimacy and the systems themselves are national, and some of them are breaking down. Now, that's a staggering set of challenges to think about, which relate to pretty well every area of human activity, particularly when the political systems involved are so radically different. It's difficult to do this at all, but when you're dealing with political systems that are radically different. But I think the thing we have to start off with in trying to address this question for me is, why is this important? Why does it matter how these two countries relate to one another? And it seems to me it's in the areas in the respects that I've just mentioned.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I'm jumping to the second question, just trying to cover ground here. To what extent to what extent is the crisis of democracy a consequence of capitalism's inequalities? I think you've touched on that, but maybe we can you can expand a little bit more on the inequalities and how they lead to the crisis of democracy.
I think I have come to the view that they are very central. Now, it's important to note what sort of inequalities they are. Inequality is a very complex idea, obviously, and it has many, many dimensions. But first and foremost, there are inequalities perceived in relationship to the state of which one is a member, of which one's a part. So one might argue, and some philosophers do, that the only real inequalities that matter are the inequalities among all human beings. You know, why should you be more concerned about the inequality among Americans, since all Americans basically are pretty rich people? Even poor Americans are pretty rich people. We should be concerned only about inequality among everybody. Well, it follows, if we're thinking about this in terms of democracy, then democracy, as I said, is related to a specific polity. And so it's inequality within that polity that matters. And above all, among the citizens of that polity. That's very important. That's rather radical implications, by the way, for example, for immigration, but also for other issues. So you get into this horror that you have to start thinking about America first. Is that a natural outgrowth of concern about inequality? I'm afraid it is. I mean, not the policies of Trump. But of course, if you think about inequality as a national phenomenon, politically very important, you end up with the idea that people who are citizens of your country matter more than others, because otherwise you wouldn't be concerned about it. That's a very important part of my book. Now, the other set, why does it matter? Because I think the democratic polity functions if all citizens feel that they matter. They really matter. And if you get basically nothing, you know, you're scraping by and never get a better life, and you can't educate your children, and you don't have decent schooling and all the rest of it, while others are living glorious, wonderful life, you can't think that you matter. And then if in addition, another set of elites, so one set of elites is screwing you that way, and another set of elites are saying, in addition to all that, all your values and ideas about how you should live your life are worthless too. So that's the equality of respect issue, which is quite a difficult one. Then you get a lot of very, very, very angry and bitter people, perfectly understandably, by the way, at different dimensions, and they're going to go for somebody who's going to rectify this. And then you get civil war. And that's where we are. So I think inequalities of income are very bad. But I also have come to the view there has to be some limit to inequalities of respect, which is a very difficult thing. It's not a central part of my book because I'm an economist, but I am coming to the view that this is quite important. One of the great things that happened in the mid-20th century, but in a very different context, and it didn't work in all societies, and it worked terribly with ethnically diverse societies like America, is that because of the political power of the organized working class and the presence of democratic institutions in which they were very powerful, basically everybody had some sort of political agency. So that's another aspect of inequality. If a few people have political agency and most people feel they don't, then you are it's basically undemocratic. So yeah, national versions of equality, the sense you are matter as a citizen, is central to the stability of democracy, and that is what Aristotle was telling us. But remember, of course, Aristotle shamefully supported slavery.
Okay. So I would like to do one more question, if that's possible. Third question, also coming through the thread. How can we conceptualize the relationships between corporate and political powers in the East and the West? I think that's a very interesting question, especially against the background of the second question we just had. We talked about equality of individuals, right? And now this third question here brings in conceptualizing the relationship between corporate and political powers in East and West. Just
by East, do you think that means China? Or there are so many different definitions of East.
Yeah, look, as a German, East is quite fraught sometimes, right? As an English speaker, when we talk about China, I would say that means you would use Far East.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure that the distinctions between the contemporary, we used to talk about East and West, and we meant the Soviet Empire, right? 40 years ago. That's disappeared in that form. And what has replaced it, in my view, in most places, not everywhere, are various forms of bandit capitalism combined with autocracy, pretty corrupt autocracy. So I don't think of it as a genuinely separate system. The Chinese system is a genuinely distinct system. But if you want, one could say there are three ways of thinking about this, all of which are to do with the relationship between economic and political power. That's the core issue. In a functioning democracy, there is which exists, Switzerland say, reasonably well, economic and political power exists, but they are to a significant degree, not totally separate, or to some degree separated by a set of norms and institutions, legal and political, and of behavior, which allow them to operate in their spheres. And so political power remains legitimate and democratic. And while economic power does influence the political system, it clearly does, it doesn't own it. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is about containing the role of business institutions in political funding. I think an absolutely core element in the collapse of the United States into a plutocracy is the collapse of any control on political funding and lobbying. Mm-hmm. So that's a system that works. One sort of it. So it's a balance between economic and political power, with political power ultimately somewhat stronger. Then you've got what I think of as bandit capitalism, which is in which economic and political power are merged. Usually, they're not always around a boss. I think a boss is the right way of describing it, who doles out favors to and gets rewards in return from favored business interests. I think this is a gangster state, and Russia. So not particularly, it's not very difficult to think of other examples. And that's what I think Mr. Trump would create in America if he knew how to do it and could do it. So that's a separate system. If that's East, I don't know. It's where political and economic power emerged under the view of a strongman, but essentially in a completely rent-extracting way. Douglas North had very good stuff on this before he died. Mm-hmm. And then finally, there's the unique role of the East Asian Confucian state, which again is a permanent structure, lots of corruption, but in the essence, political power dominates economic power ultimately, and political power is, however, while it is responsible for the state and the people, it is utterly unaccountable, in principle unaccountable. And that's a very interesting political system, which the West has really never had in that way. And it's the way, I think, Chinese people think about legitimate power. So, and we've had a beautiful demonstration of that this week with the Chinese government stepping all over one of China's most important business people and telling him, well, actually, we're in charge, not you. And that wouldn't happen in America. To put it mildly. So it's the way there, I think, ultimately, the political system, the state system dominates the economy and the economy exists to serve the state system. And these are three fundamentally different systems, which correspond to what I put forward in my little introduction and in my book. A genuine liberal democracy, to the extent it exists, and there are some genuine liberal democracies, what I call autocratic demagogic politics, and communist autocratic politics, which could be described also as Confucian, Neo-Confucian, or whatever you like. And those are three genuinely different systems for organizing economies and polities. And two of them, I think, can work. The gangster state is ultimately a catastrophic dead end, I think, but it's also a natural one. The basic point Douglas North made is that former system, the patrimonial state, if you like, the state which is used to create wealth for the people who control it. That's the most traditionally political system of humanity, and it's re-emerging everywhere. And it's always a disaster, but it is a natural form of political life, alas.
Okay, thank you very much. I feel you and myself and probably everyone in the audience, we could go on and on and on, but we just take this conversation as a teaser for your upcoming book. And
I wouldn't write it the way I have written it if I were right now. I think these are the most fascinating questions of our time, because if we can't solve these, we can't do anything.
That's probably correct. Fingers crossed for where we're going. Thank you so much for this very, very insightful conversation, Martin. We wish you very well, and thank you so much for joining today. And I wish everyone in the audience a wonderful experience at this plenary. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great pleasure.
Mm-hmm. So, I think we're going back into the studio.
Hello, welcome back, everyone. As you can probably tell, I'm not Cecilia who started this session. My name is Magali Brosio, and I will take over as a moderator for this part of the session right now. We just heard an amazing talk by Martin Wolf, and I hope it left you inspired and energized enough to do some hands-on work on the questions right now. So as you already know, during this talk, you had the opportunity to suggest new questions, but also to like questions suggested by others. But even these great questions, which we already selected, can be further improved by doing some rephrasing. So what we're going to do right now is work on these questions one by one, trying to find perhaps a better rephrasing that is either more inspiring, more accurate, and we will do this in the same order that appear in the platform. We'll start with the question that reads, how can we conceptualize the relationships between corporate and political powers in the East and West? We already had some hints that we perhaps need to be more clear about what it means, the East and the West. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to go ahead and perhaps suggest a better phrasing. If you wish, you can also take the floor and make a statement in support of your rephrasing. And you are also allowed to change your like. So for instance, if another phrasing that you'd like better is suggested for this question, but you already like the original question, feel free to move around your like and choose a different one. I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about different options for this question. Okay, perhaps let's go to our next question. Our next question reads, to what extent the crisis of democracy is a consequence of capitalism's inequalities? We still don't have any new phrasings for any of these questions. The rephrasing option is open to any of these, to all of these questions at the same time. So even though we might be discussing the second one, you can still go back to the first one and suggest a rephrasing if you come up with something. However, it is possible that we already like the original phrasing of this question, and that's perfectly fine. So I see that we have another proposal for that one. How can we reconcile the inequalities of capitalism to ensure a healthy democratic process and a coherent society? So we can move our likes around. If we like that phrasing better than the previous one, that's perfectly fine. So the new rephrasing received plenty of likes, but the other formulation still preferred. We'll see when we end. And before we finish, we have the opportunity to think about rephrasing the first question that we posed to Martin Wolf, which is what could and what should change in the US-China relationship after the US election. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to go ahead and propose rephrasing to that one. Okay, we have a new phrasing. Is it possible to avoid the new Cold War between China and the USA? Well, it's a sort of different, perhaps, question, but it's an interesting perspective as well. Okay, you had the opportunity to face the questions that we proposed to Martin Wolf, but most of the formulations that were originally proposed by someone here were the winners. So we'll take the original formulations then. These questions now kind of received favorites and had the opportunity to join the constellation. Unlike likes, favorites are limited. So over the course of the entire plenary, you will have a total of 10 stars to pick your favorite questions from the whole galaxy and all constellations. However, they are not set in stone. I mean, you can choose a question as your favorite now and then change it later in the future if you find a question that you like it better. But they are limited either way. In the end, the favorites will determine which questions are among the 100 new economic questions guiding future research and projects in the YSI community. Oh, and don't forget that your favorites will be displayed on your YSI profile. As you can see, you can put a star next to the question if you like it. If you think this is one of the most important questions of our time, feel free to go ahead and click on the star. And you can also choose one of the speakers' questions proposed by Martin Wolf as your favorite if you like them. So we don't have any more time for today, unfortunately. Thank you for joining us for that very exciting talk by Martin Wolf and for this very energizing discussion about the most pressing question of our time. The next session is starting in 15 minutes, so you have enough time to short break, and I'll see you soon.